Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming and a little look at our first week of Season 4. With it being so much faster to level now, we've actually got to see everyone reach level 100 and get gearing and pushing endgame content so much sooner. So we're already seeing clears of over level 110 pits, which would be roughly a tier 21 abattoir of Zir according to the devs anyway. Back then, it took us some serious time in Season 2 to actually reach that level, and this has happened again in the first week. Not to mention, the Torment version of bosses are on farm already. Nicely challenging, but thankfully farmable enough. Compared to the boring nature of just one-shotting the regular versions over and over and over infinitely, I much prefer this myself. And with all that highlighted, what's the best build for each class? Now we've got to see how things really stand. Let's take a look. For Necromancer, the answer is instant and obvious. It is minion Necromancer, of course. But there are different kinds to consider, leaning heavily into the raw damage from your golem, having consistent DPS through, say, your shadow mages, or maybe really leaning into shadow damage over time in general, with all the perks and the paragon you could consider there. There are benefits to all of them. The big numbers, the consistent output, the defensive utility. Undeniable that some kind of full minion build is the best right now, not just for Necromancers, but likely for the whole game flat out. You may have been seeing these insane clips of billions of damage, and that absolutely is possible, but there's also a weird bug going on for Necromancers I want to highlight and kind of discredit almost the power of Necromancer, because it's being pushed further than it really is. The Holy Bolt's elixir is causing these massive spikes in damage, essentially randomly. It's tied to companion AI or something like that. It's triggering these massive hits, as though your proc is also proccing with every companion aka minion all at once. So the more you have, I guess the better. With this being so effective with minion Necromancer then, and all you're having to do is actually pop an elixir, everyone's using it. So we're seeing way better output than the minion Necromancer really has. This is how we saw the recent 42 billion hit from Vega, one of the top Necromancers, or how we're seeing bug abuse with this to clear really high pit levels beyond maybe what the Necromancer is not necessarily capable of, but you know, pushing things a lot faster than it otherwise would be. This is a pit level 126 clear by the Sin, and yeah, it's using this elixir to dumpster most things. But we still are able to hit billions of damage even without using that bug. I'm pushing towards, say, 1 billion on my hits right now with my current set, and we've seen clips of people like Vega again who hit 3.3 billion again without using the bolt elixir at all. So minion Necromancer is dominating with its incredible output without that elixir bug. Just be aware that they suddenly might fix that elixir, and if you're relying on it, it could be gone. If it is removed, the question of best build overall for everyone, minion Necromancer, that might actually depend. We're seeing Necromancer players struggle more with survivability than output in higher level pits. To progress the pits, you need to become essentially immortal, unkillable, and then once you've achieved that, you can push the DPS as far as it can go and kill things. Necromancer goes the other way. It has such incredible output that it's able to not worry about survivability as much as everyone else. When we're reaching these higher levels of pits though, we're seeing how much they have to work back the DPS in favor of survivability, and that's become more of a limiting factor for the Necromancer. You can compare that to the Barbarians, the previous kings of the abattoir, who are already showing up super well in the pits for the same reasons. They're able to just stand there and face tank hits, where Necromancer can't always be doing that. So ultimately, it's too early to say what the best build overall is, in my opinion, but we can easily say for a Necromancer, a full minion based build of some kind is their best option, and it's been nice to finally have that class fantasy of a Necromancer at last. Speaking of Barbarian there though, let's now talk about them directly. The best build for Barbarian seems to come down to two options right now. That is the bash build, which is definitely better for boss killing and therefore is going to stand out more in pit pushing and boss farming, what we're all doing. Whereas the very popular Dust Devil build is fantastic for general gameplay, that ease of use. You can consistently clear everything around you when farming Helltides. The Whispers we're all doing for money right now, the PvP zones, fast clearing of Nightmare dungeons for glyph XP. There's argument to be said that just because Bash has the best output does not mean it's the best build for what we're all doing right now. We're collecting gear, building up power, clearing pits at around level 60 to 70 because that's where, you know, the rewards actually are. Pushing pits above tier 100, well, that's purely for fun at this point. You have to ask yourself, what is your current relevant goal in the game? That's why I think it might be valid to say that Dust Devil is better overall for your average player in these opening weeks. However, Bash Barb is obviously better long term. It's going to tackle the main challenge of the pits, which is the bosses, much better than anything else they can right now. At a certain point, we're going to reach a tier of pits where you reach that boss and it's a massive wall of health to get through. If you sacrificed too much to stay alive to have DPS that can clear that massive health bar, well then it's a problem. So Barbarian using the bash build is tackling that issue the best for them. This build was heavily encouraged in Season 4 after a lot of buffs to it. It's like a permanent cleave for big damage, and then the raw survivability of the Barb comes into play to keep them alive. Rob in this footage is pushing a tier 110 pit and it's just standing there in the damage, barely dodging or avoiding elite mechanics or much of anything, just grouping them up and smacking them. This is how Abattoir devolved in interest in my eyes. It comes down to being immortal and then just smacking the targets, not using skill or impressive strategy, just slamming yourself against health bars. When we look at Rogue, it's going to be a stark contrast between the two. Rogue is fighting to push and exist in that level of content. Still, between the gauntlet and the abattoir or pits, the pits are just a much more popular form of content that's been proven, so Barbarians might be able to push further than Necromancers based on survivability. We will see. Now, speaking of Rogue, let's take a look at that. This footage is by Mippy, a top Rogue player who pushed this tier 100 in just 6 minutes, which is pretty incredible. I wasn't sure Rogue could even survive this level of damage that's being thrown at them, even if their output can handle it, obviously. But what's fascinating about this setup by Mippy is that he's CCing the enemy rather than ever letting them really attack him. They're being frozen, dazed, stunned, or otherwise, preventing them from actually killing him through this high level of control. When he reaches the boss, you can see how, yeah, the really good DPS is great, but he staggers it really quick too, avoiding every mechanic with the awesome speed and ability of a rogue. This is the comparison I wanted to make between a barb pit clear and a rogue's. This is way more engaging and interesting to me personally, but you can see how rogues are having to try a lot harder. And we're talking about something that's 10 levels lower than the barb one. So the moment this stops working, it's not like they're going to have the insane survivability of a barbarian to rely on. But what is this build though? It's really clever. It's a heartseeker rogue, which is actually a very underused basic that's now much more relevant in Season 4. This becomes the main DPS ability here, a basic attack. It seeks an enemy on use, increasing crit strike chance against them, building up more as you go. This also increases your attack speed when you do crit, and it ricochets around passively to other targets. Mippy combines that with Flurry as a combo point spender as a core, but it's definitely not the main source of damage at all. Everything's built around the Heartseeker. He's pushed it to 13 levels for its maximum output. The other skills are things like Caltrops and Smokes, which were also underused in the past, all to help control and maintain survivability, while Heartseeker just does its thing. There's quite a lot of clever underused aspects here, like Retribution. Distant enemies have a chance to be stunned, and you deal more damage to stunned or knockdown enemies. The Moonrise aspect, the basic of Heartseeker is stacking up 4% attack speed every time it attacks. This kind of caps out and triggers something called Vampiric Blood Rage, meaning your basic skill damage shoots up by 160% times. Then there's affixes like chance for Heartseeker projectiles to cast twice. It's a basic attack build. And with the incredible amount of basic attacks being used at once, Mippy works in Undying, an aspect that heals you for 2% life or double that when you're under half health every time you use a skill. So every time a Heartseeker is used, which is like a machine gun, it's healing him constantly, which is providing that much needed sustain after anything does hit him. So I find this build extremely unique, very clever with all the CC, and surely the best way at this known time to push pits as a rogue. What about sorcerers though? Let's cover them next. Josh, our resident sorcerer main, is convinced that the best build and option overall right now is Blizzard. It's currently the build with the highest pit clear known outside of either, say, the Cheese Immortal build that absolutely has terrible DPS but is immortal, or there's the Ball Lightning build that does require ideal stats and even uber uniques to hit its high, alongside Frozen Orb with similar stuff. So it's much like what we mentioned with Barbs and what your general gameplay purpose is, what's really achievable right now versus long term, and what actually covers all these bases. Blizzard is able to achieve incredibly high DPS when given the chance to smash a target, such as say boss farming, which is what we're mostly doing right now. It's also very reliable and a safe option for clearing in pits, because you're placing this AoE down and then you can move away to avoid the damage coming your way, or stack a bunch, more and more on top of a target or targets to skyrocket the damage. Not to mention you can reach incredible levels of survivability, that damage mitigation you need to be pushing higher pits while standing in your blizzards. Josh does feel that Blizzard falls behind in one aspect though, and that's kind of the pure speed farming, which to be fair is another big part of what we've been doing. Maybe you've been spamming out higher tier nightmare dungeons for glyph XP, or farming Helltides to get your gear and Iron Wolf rep. Admittedly, Frozen Orb is actually great for that. But then, what about bosses? What about pushing really high tier pits and so on? That's maybe where Blizzard is winning out. It's certainly not the case that Blizzard has any issue with those easier, faster forms of content. It's just that it's not as fast or as smooth at clearing them. It does seem pretty cool though that sorcerers have this variety of options. Blizzard, Bolt Lightning, Frozen Orb, even the Firebolt stuff with the Flame Shield cheese, they're very valid options. And it's not like the Incinerate build is terrible either. So I think sorcerers do have a lot of great options in this endgame, even if maybe their output isn't as competitive as Barbarian and minion Necromancer. Overall though, Josh feels Blizzard is the best option for your average player currently. Given time, there's clear value in Ball Lightning and Frozen Orb with the ideal gear, the kind that will take some time to achieve. Alright, so last but not least, we have the Druid. For this one, it's more interesting than I expected. Everyone thought going in, post BTR nerfs, Tornado Druid would just be king. It was expected that their other best build, Hurricane, just wouldn't perform as it did in BTR, and that's certainly the case. It was obviously busted. But it's more of a matchup now than I expected to find. Over the last few days, there's been a surprising amount of argument for Hurricane Druid over Tornado, but maybe that's because Hurricane is so gear dependent, as well as quite mechanical. Tornado Druid is fantastic for opening the season with, for gearing up, for the speed of that, the basic content that you're progressing in your first week. You can fly around quick, killing everything as your tornadoes spiral out while speeding your way through content such as Helltides or Nightmare Dungeons for the Glyph XP. Where it seems to struggle is survivability. For me, it's been unfortunate to find so much less pit footage for Druid in general, maybe because they're just having a harder time with it. Hurricane might be the answer. I want to credit iBoiler for this, a prominent figure in the Druid space. He and a few others seem to think that Hurricane could be the best option for something like longer or higher pit pushing, where Tornado Werewolf is kind of starting to struggle around that tier 90 plus mark. The problem, as Boilers explained, is that Hurricane needs endgame tempering and even masterworking to reach its true critical mass to work. The idea is to cause the Hurricanes to crit and overpower at once, lasting also much longer because of the temper affixes that increase Hurricane's duration. Because the build isn't dependent on having high resource generation or pushing other DPS stats hard as their affixes, this actually leaves you with more space to put in survivability, the concept required for high pit pushing. You need to be able to tank the hits before you need to worry about DPS. The build requires careful play to manage your buffs and max potential. It does seem to have higher potential than Tornado if you're willing, but it certainly seems a lot more mechanically demanding. If you're not willing, then it's still a fair call to stick with Tornado, but it does seem like you gotta be ready to reach a wall when pushing pits. Still, it's good that Druid does have options. We'll see how it does longer term. But there you have it. That's my overview of the best builds at the end of this first week. I hope this look could give you some perspective on where things are right now and what each class is kind of working on. Maybe this was useful or just interesting, but either way, thank you for watching. I've been Hollow, you've been you, and I'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.